Hi, my name is Jeff Kinsberg. I'm the founder, visionary, and entrepreneur behind JackTool. JackTool is a precision product development company and contract manufacturer, developing enabling technologies for MedTech and our nation's defense. JackTalk is a podcast where we pull back the curtain on how we take ideas to done. Our discussions cover process, people, from innovation to execution, and how we've provided our customers a competitive advantage for over 30 years. On today's show, we are joined by Ben Weir. Ben, you are a mechanical engineer and project lead at JackTool.
Yes.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
So on this episode, this is the second episode in a 4-part series where we touch on our innovation, execution, and transfer process. For those in the audience, there is an episode prior to this where there's a high-level summary. And on this episode, we're going to take a deeper dive into what is innovation. So I think I know what innovation is. We've discussed what it is. Google has its opinion. Every AI out there has its opinion. But let's, between the two of us, kind of try to land the plane on what is it at JackTool and how does that give us a competitive advantage with our customers. Cool. So Ben, you have, I would argue that you have an innovative skill set, right? So innovation. So I used to argue that where we work in MedTech and DoD, there is a cross-pollination of knowledge that occurs because those industries are very siloed and processes are slightly different, vernacular is very different, but people get siloed. So you have a unique skill set where you have a background in industrial design.
Yes.
And you're a mechanical engineer. And let's talk a little bit about how those two skill sets can come together. I guess maybe for those in the audience who don't know what ID is, we could touch on that. But how do you leverage? So in many organizations, those job functions are compartmentalized.
Yes.
Right? And one of the things that we do here is cross-training and bringing in team members that can wear multiple hats and through the use of communication and leveraging our other core values, go through the development wickets faster and de-risk. So you have two skill sets, and I'd say those two skill sets combined make you innovative. So what is industrial design?
Sure. It's a little vague. Everyone's opinion probably differs a little. In my experience, I kind of like to summarize it as more of a focus on the form of a product and its interaction with the end user, while mechanical engineering might lean towards more of a functional approach and executing how something works more than how it looks. That's probably how I'd kind of summarize it.
Are you, so I Googled so as we were talking before this discussion, I always think of ID as form, fit, a little bit of function, user experience. I think of like swoopy curves and splines and French curves and all that fun stuff, right? And tones and textures.
Yep.
I'm not wrong or I'm wrong?
No, you're not wrong.
Okay. So Google says, I'm glad because that's what I just thought over the years. Google says that industrial design is more form and fit for scale up for things that are mass produced. So I guess designing into products, methods, processes that allow them to scale.
Sure.
Is that, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think that's too far off the mark. I think kind of like as with our company and engineering, sometimes we're designing bespoke things to prove out a concept. Same can kind of apply with industrial design. Typically the industrial design falls towards the end of a product's, design lifecycle where it's like, okay, we have the innards, we know how it's going to work. Now we just got to package it up and make it look good. So typically it is with mass manufacturing in mind, but a lot of the time, it's still prototyping. These companies just want to see, hey, if we did go down that path, how does it look? So it's a kind of an interesting balance, but I would say, yeah, a lot of the time there's a lot of thought that goes into, mass production.
Mm-hmm. So strictly from sharing those two skill sets that you bring to JackTool, the mechanical engineering and the industrial design, have you so from prior discussions, your prior experience was more on the industrial design focus. You wanted to be more technical,
yes.
numbers, detailed design. Mm-hmm. Have you in your process now focused on a mechanical engineer? How have you maybe leveraged your industrial design background to do things that we could call are innovative?
Sure. I think industrial design, like I said earlier, often it falls at the end of a product design lifecycle. It kind of has its place at multiple stages, and often it's at the end or at the very beginning. And when it's at the beginning, there's so much room to play and so much scope that one skill set that most industrial designers will have to learn, if they don't already have it, is to be able to kind of like hone in a little bit. It's like kind of like when you're a kid and you go into a candy store and there's like too many options. The skill of narrowing down so that you're not totally, free to go in every possible direction, to kind of, otherwise you just get lost in a myriad of different, ideas. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a skill that I have been able to use at JackTool, especially with some of the conceptual stuff on the med device side, where it's like, okay, the client comes in and they say, hey, we want to do this. We don't know how. Before you just like lose your mind and you think about all these different things that you could do, you kind of have to, set some road, some like milestones where you're like, okay, we don't want to go too far off the beaten track. Let's, try and bring things in a little bit. And I think that's a skill that I personally have found really useful, is to be able to, have the ability to think outside the box and come up with these like wacky ideas, even if we, can just say we did it so that we can say no to this. And we know at least moving forward that that's not a viable option. I think that's been something that I brought over from industrial design that I find useful on an almost daily basis.
Okay. So thinking outside the box, seeing the forest through the trees, mm-hmm. It's very easy to be too close to a problem.
Yes.
Right? But I would almost, is it, question to you is, having that ID background where you're constantly trying to step away from the problem and look back on it from up above, mm-hmm. Does that give you, or do you think that gives you the ability to get different perspectives and ideate and challenge yourself?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. I think I also, going off a little bit, I also struggle with like getting hyper focused and like tunnel vision. And I think that's something that every designer has.
That's the mechanical engineer.
Yeah, probably. But no, being able to kind of like take a step back and look at the bigger picture and, assess multiple different avenues is it's a very valuable thing to be able to do. Mm-hmm. And with the type of work that we do at the pace we do it, that is kind of a critical thing to be able to do, is to be able to just step back and look at like, okay, this avenue is working in this way and this avenue is working in a different way. How can we bring the successful aspects of each concept together to move forward with one that's,
right,
the best of both?
Right. So, I guess what is innovation, right? There's a baseline of expectations that, our peers in industry say a person of ordinary skill has this level of, mm-hmm. Aptitude, right? And then you're below that line, you say, there's room for improvement. And you're above that line. I would almost argue when you're above that line, that starts to teeter on innovation, right? Because mm-hmm. there's no specific process, skill, capability that, you have a certain pen that doesn't necessarily make you innovative,
right?
Or the paper, or right, but you start to amass certain things, certain strategies, tactics, processes, people, values, and that starts to create innovation. Mm-hmm. Right? So there's always this time compression and de-risking that just is inevitable with any project. And the cart and the horse, and what order are they in, and can you do them in parallel, and can we get an alternate horse to pull the cart while we're working on the real horse, and all sorts of strategies to go faster, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because this is a race to get to market, to field technology, to improve lives. So having the dual skill set, somebody says, I have a form factor that this needs to do. And you're also responsible for integrating the system, in the mechanical design and the other trades that feed into it. Are you making decisions saying mechanical form factor, we'll say ID, mechanical ID, and you're essentially doing it in parallel?
Yes, it's pretty nuanced, actually. Different. I feel like there's in different applications you can have them running in parallel. I think one thing that is important to be able to do when you need to is to separate the two, and you can still keep them in mind. I can make design improvements to the function while not actually making any changes to the form, but I'm keeping in mind, okay, I'm doing this one thing to improve one aspect. It also needs to function with the other, part of it. It's kind of like some of the stuff that we design, we're designing it to be 3D printed, but we know down the road it has to be injection molded. So I'm not going to shoot myself in the foot and create double the work by just forgetting injection molding, even though it doesn't have to be injection moldable now, but I don't want it to be a complete redesign down the road. So that's a time where, I guess that's more on the mechanical engineering side, but it's still a form function, really.
Right.
And that's something that it's good to be able to do.
So having near-term goals for a minimum viable product, an MVP, having long-term goals for what does producibility in scale look like, knowing the form factor and how that needs to present, balancing the mechanical, the integration side of it. At a minimum, you're doing 4 things at the same time.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I guess that to me feels like an innovative skill set.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah. It's a lot of fun.
Cool. So how do so what are your thoughts on how, so we have this innovate, execute, transfer. It's easy to say the 3 words look good in a row, but, executing, transferring, innovation, they can kind of start there. There's blocks, there's goals and capabilities. There's capabilities that happen at each one of those phases, but it's not to say that does innovation always occur on the front end?
No. Innovation, I mean, we were talking a little earlier, I feel like innovation happens everywhere. I think it's easy to just focus on the design because, especially to somebody that either isn't an engineer or a designer or work here, just sees us and sees products being, output. And if you don't have a good grasp on what goes into that, you might think, oh, it's just design. But at every stage in a product's life cycle, from sourcing, design, concepting, manufacturing, everything has innovation in it. And it's like, I think that's the skill that everybody here has, is that ability to think creatively, to overcome issues. It might be, okay, we need this part machined. Ideally it's one part, but then somebody in the shop might say, well, actually, if you split this into 2, it's actually going to be cheaper, easier to make, and more, it's easier down the road if we do move down, mass manufacturing or even, sourcing. A lot of the time, it's tempting for me to say, this is the exact part I need. But they have the skill set to think outside the box and say, well, actually, you could do this way with these parts instead.
Right.
And it's something that you wouldn't even think about. So I think there's innovation in every stage. I think it's just easy to assume it's just in the design because that's the visual output from the company.
Right. And you wouldn't, that's a really good example where everything is a conversation, right? you generate new tech data, you generate concepts.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what people need to understand on the team here is that we're not at a design freeze. We're still in the development phase, right? So this is different whether you're at a design freeze with a validated, registered, you know, product on record. That's different, right?
Yep.
But, you know, I think this is a lot of the earlier conversations which kind of went into the root of where I found success in JackTool,
Mm-hmm. doing
the type of work we do now, where engineers would reach out to me, right? Or you know, I'm a mechanical engineer. I know mechanical engineers, and they reach out and say, "Can you help me design, make my things?" And a lot of these conversations 20 years ago, and it's very nuanced how this is delivered.
Mm-hmm.
Is I can do that, but I think you might be crazy.
Yeah,
right? Is this really what we want to do? So, and then that it's, you know, it's not friction. It's just challenging each other through healthy conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Is what starts to drive the process forward faster,
mm-hmm.
because just saying yes is not always the answer.
Right.
Right. So what you're saying is, you know, like in the example you mentioned, sourcing, here's my drawing. I need these things.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But keep your ears open, and my ears are open.
Mm-hmm.
If you see different materials, alternate sources of supply, you know, if we're subcontracting, you know, engineering or manufacturing out, tell us, you know, we're open, we're receptive to that feedback, because, you know, ultimately it makes everyone's jobs easier. It de-risks the product. It
Absolutely.
Probably drives down cost.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, nobody wants to fall into the trap of designing something that only one person can make or source. And,
yep.
and then you have a supply chain challenge.
Yes,
right.
Absolutely.
Any thought? So, you know, the question is, you know, how does our innovate phase differ from, I guess, what you've seen out there in
mm-hmm.
other companies? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I think, to me, with the experience that I have, I think the biggest thing that jumps out about JackTool that I didn't have at previous employers was the ability to iterate fast and answer my own questions with the team that we have, right? Like, a lot of the time at my old job, it was like, okay, you design something and you don't get validation until those parts come in. And a lot of the time you don't actually get any, that's just like a yes or a no. You don't get the useful input that I think gives people the knowledge that they need to innovate well. So like here, it's like, I have a part that I need. I'm sure somebody can make it,
mm-hmm.
but when I take it into the shop, those guys have all the expertise to say, okay, I see what you want to do, but that's not the best way of doing it. Let's do it differently. And that knowledge is what gives people the ability to innovate
mm-hmm.
better, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. And I think you know, just the speed of which that community. So this can go both ways. It is fantastic having all of these team members, you know, on site, different disciplines, able to contribute, so you can get feedback very quickly.
Yes.
It's also a disadvantage because at some point somebody's like, I really want to talk to you, Ben, but I'm trying to focus on something else.
Yes.
So what does that pushback look like?
I think it's all like a healthy push and pull, and like, you know, everyone has their own way of operating. I can't work from home. I know we don't work from home a lot, but like at my old job, like when I had to work at home from stints, it was just tough for me. But, you know, being able to just kind of get up, go and ask somebody a question is the best.
Mm-hmm.
It's just about knowing who you're asking and what they're doing, and just respecting, you know, everybody's way of working. Right. But when you get that balance right, it's perfect.
Yeah. And this is the balance. So, you know, like all organizations that went through, you know, the pandemic and the shift to remote or on-site or hybrid, that, you know, there was a lot of discussion here about where do we land the plane with
mm-hmm.
that. And, you know, some job functions here can definitely be remote. Some job functions cannot be remote.
Mm-hmm.
But, when you talk about speed and communication, right, that is part of our underlying selling point as a service of providing that agility to move faster than our customers, right? If our customers, all of our customers, for the most part, have the capabilities that we have here, right? You have the machine, you have the sourcing, the engineering, and all those disciplines. But, big companies are designed to do big projects, right? And when you're buying a submarine, right, some $3 billion thing, it might take you a couple years to figure out what a contract looks like, and it might take even longer to build it.
Yep.
Right. We're not designed as a company to build submarines.
Correct.
Right. But that same company that builds the submarine, when you start to look at smaller subassemblies and components that go on it, or innovative ways to new products that would go into it, I would think it's a better use of resources when those smaller components of it move out of house to smaller agile development houses, because we can just move faster.
Absolutely.
Right? We can turn around POs in I don't know how fast. There's a process, but it can be a half hour versus there's 6 people on a chain.
Right.
Somebody's working from home, they're away from their computer. We'll try to get this out tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Right? That doesn't get you to market fast enough.
Right.
And so, with balance is what is the right amount of balance of, we as an organization support very large, mature customers, right? And we speak that language, but finding with our processes and culture here, how do we integrate and deliver things that can feed very mature systems, but also exist on our island, for lack of a better word, to move fast and then transfer it to the next step.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what are some of the tools and I don't know, what are ways that, I don't know, how do you handle the balance between engineering requirements and manufacturing in the design phase, manufacturability?
Right.
I guess you touched on that. You said you walk out to the shop.
A little bit. That to me is my favorite part about working at JackTool.
Okay.
is just being able to bounce other people's knowledge around the room. Like the fact that I can go over to one person and get information about something very niche and specific, and then I can walk, 5 yards across the room and have another conversation with somebody else with an entirely different skill set is incredibly valuable. And the shop is, for me, one of the best tools as a designer, because in my experience, there's hang up from design. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, where it's like, and this is generalizing. I'm not saying this is for everybody, but in my experience, I've noticed that industrial designers often prioritize manufacturability lower than mechanical engineer. And conversely, mechanical engineers prioritize form lower. And being able to do a bit of both is the best. And we have the resources to bounce around that knowledge. And I just think it's very healthy to be able to go and ask before we create a print and before we finalize the design, to be able to go and say, actually, is this the best way of doing it? Or is there a better way? Before we bake it all in, and make drawings and everything. Because that's what happens to a lot of companies that don't have the in-house capability, is that you spend all this time polishing something that you don't know is necessarily going to work, and then you have to undo all of that.
Right.
And even if it's something that we don't make in-house, I'm frequently going to the shop to say, hey, I know you guys aren't going to make this, but to keep costs down and to speed things up and not be a nightmare to the person that has to make my parts, how can I do this in a better way to make a more reliable product, basically?
Right. And I'll tread lightly. We're going to go with this. There are a lot of companies that design and build under one roof. I worked for one. We still have a lot of, I think fondly of them. They're out there watching in the ether. I still talk to them regularly. They had manufacturing in-house too. And, you know, my hobby is machining, and I would love to walk out into the shop and just watch them, you know, watch them make chips, watch them weld, you know, get certified on the forklift, and I had fun playing with overhead cranes to make some of my pet projects. But there was a different culture. The culture there was more, you know, I guess stereotypes are bad. Some stereotypes are for a reason. And it takes work to change them.
Yes.
But I would walk out on the shop floor, a very gruff place, and it would be, young engineer, I'm being very polite now. Just get out of here. Right? What are you doing? You're going to hurt yourself. Go back to your cube. Go do whatever it is you do. And I was told this in many impolite ways. I say that with respect for those watching, because I'm sure some of there'll be some, my phone will ring after this at some point. But there's a difference between having those trades and those skills and breaking the mold of how they communicate.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll say that maybe that communication piece and how we integrate as a team is a competitive advantage, and we'll say in quotes, innovative.
Yep.
Maybe.
Oh, I agree.
So there's a lot of different tools, and we don't need to touch on it in this discussion, that we can use upstream, you know, to help refine creativity, right? We talk about SWOT analysis, like strengths, weakness, opportunities, threats.
Yep.
Failure mode, effects analysis. I know we do a lot of risk registers to de-risk at you know, through the project phase. But what would you say are some of the, not specifically those tools, but what are some of the traits, skills, abilities, practices that go into being a project lead and running the project that contribute to innovation, but also de-risk?
I think one thing that I have experienced as a project lead that has helped a lot is having the transparency and regular, honest communication with the customer, being able to bounce ideas back and forth regularly, you know, not with a big gap in between, allows you to quite quickly maybe redirect if you're going down a path that isn't desirable, or even to just ask a question. You know, like, we do the best we can to de-risk at the beginning of a project by, I personally think that risk is just unknowns, right? When something's risky, it's because you're not sure that you're going to be able to do something. And a lot of the de-risking can be done at the beginning by just understanding everything you need to execute what you need for that part of the project. But it's the ability to like have that conversation throughout the project too, because you can't think of everything at the beginning. You do the best you can, but you're only going to get, 80-90% of what you need at the beginning. And there's frequent periods throughout the project where you run into an issue that you didn't expect to have, and you need further clarification. And it's the ability to be able to go to the customer at that point and say, hey, we ran into this problem. Do you have any insight or any input here? Or do you want us to just move in the way we see fit?
Right.
And I personally found that to be the most useful tool. Obviously, we have all the tools, at our disposal to facilitate those, but actually just being able to talk to the customer regularly, in my opinion, has been the by far the most valuable tool.
Yeah. So last week, I was talking to a very early supporter and influencer. He's a subject matter expert in the Army. And I've worked with him for almost 20 years now. I remember one of the first bigger projects that I did, even before doing this full time, was something for his team. And we were talking about it, and I don't know if this is new. Like, what's new is every day we're a day older, right? And there's always going to be somebody, at a different point in life, right? But what we were talking about was with his team taking risks, right? He was telling me a story about one person who takes lots of notes, right? And it almost felt like they're taking notes to document the conversation in an unhealthy way, meaning we're not engaging. You're giving me instructions and you're writing them down.
Yep.
But when you're writing, you're not listening, right? And you're not also contributing to the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so we were talking about that. He's, for younger folks coming right out of school, everyone, right? We live in a world where, it's very binary. It's very quick. You're on Snapchat, you hit send, or I don't have Snapchat, but you hit send, or, sometimes there's no undo.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone becomes, with technology, like everything is documented.
Yes.
Right. So you start to spend more time covering your butt, because you're concerned about risk and failure than moving things forward.
Yes.
So, I don't know, not to lower the bar here, but just maybe takeaway for, I don't remember that, right? When I was fresh out of school, I remember making a lot of mistakes. We're taping an episode of JAKTALK next week where I'm going to bring together 3 other lifelong friends. We worked on Formula SAE, and all that stands out in my mind, besides having beers and camaraderie, is when stuff broke. Because when that stuff broke, you learned so fast, right?
It's the fastest.
I remember one time where I didn't do the math on this. This is the CYA part on this. I didn't do the math, but we all agreed as a team to switch to aluminum brake rotors that had an abrasion resistant coating on them for the Formula SAE car. Well, somebody didn't do the heat transfer calc to see how much energy these things could hold.
Nice.
And for those familiar with Formula SAE, there was an endurance event. It still might be. You go out and do 15 laps. Well, you come in for driver change, and the rear brake rotor was it was mounted on the differential. It was gone. It just melted off, right? But I'm never going to make the mistake ever again to not consider, the heat transfer and the properties of aluminum when it gets to 1200 degrees.
I mean, that's the time that you learn the fastest and the hardest. Is it's you make a decision and there's almost a repercussion for it,
right?
But you can't eliminate risk entirely. A lot of the time we want to, but there's always some risk, and it's about understanding that risk that remains and communicating it. That's I think the most important thing.
Right.
It's almost a risk mitigation in itself. Even though you're not truly eliminating the risk, you're just highlighting it and making it known that there is some uncertainty.
Without naming specifics, do you have any examples when you had to pivot during a design phase, and we'll call the pivot was innovative?
Sure. Yeah. We have an ongoing project where we had to create a tool to remove a component from a device, and there were very I don't want to say strict, but there were somewhat limiting conditions that were set, user requirements set at the very beginning, which at the time seemed perfectly fine. But as we went down the road and we iterated the design and tested, there were things that nobody anticipated happening that became roadblocks. And through, I don't know how many iterations and how many different times we 3D printed parts and machined things and modified things, each time we got a little bit closer. But there did come a limit where we had to go to the customer and say, hey, look, come in and have a look at it. Let's have a conversation, and let me highlight to you what we've done, what we haven't done, and you can see maybe what wiggle room we need. And that enabled us to open up the scope a little bit and basically add things that weren't originally on the like user requirements at the beginning. So we were able to kind of pivot at that point, and it enabled us to kind of redo certain things and add certain features that kind of helped us get to where we need to go in the end. But again, it's one of those things where it's like, you may think you know everything going into a project. Most of the time you don't. And my biggest lesson from that whole experience is to not think those are trivial aspects. You know, you might see some risk and you think, it's not that big of a deal. Can be a big deal, and it can be a real roadblock. So at least having it in your head as, okay, I'm going to get to this point in the project and I'm likely to see a problem here. It's just good to have that, like, even if it's just mentally, you know that, okay, there's a challenging aspect that's coming up, and you start to kind of prepare yourself and maybe even spool up other avenues to go down.
Mm-hmm. When you're on the design side, ideating, developing, how do you know when you're ready to, how do you know when the juice is worth the squeeze to continue to ideate versus quick intra test? We got to play with it. This is the right investment of time. And I guess where I'm going with this is that inflection point comes with skill and wisdom and past experience, but that inflection point almost becomes innovation unto itself.
Yes. Yeah. And it kind of goes back to my point about how there's innovation in every aspect of what we do. I think it's at least a battle that I'm always fighting is, I want to just keep making things more and more perfect. But at some point you have to understand that there is a minimal viable product, and it's okay for it to not be the most polished thing in the world, and to move on if it does what you need it to do. And that's a skill that I think everybody needs. And I certainly am still working on it. But I think it can be hard. It can be really hard to know, do I design freeze this and move on? Or do I keep pushing a little bit further to try and get it that extra 2%, 3% of the way to where I want it to be? But that's where understanding the user requirements thoroughly and what the targets were set by the client is the most important thing.
Right.
It helps you make those decisions in an informed way, and not just I'm bored of doing this little bit, I want to move on. It's okay, we've got to where we need to do. We checked that box, we can move on now. Right.
You touched on communication and the word conversation, and when we're, I understand that teams, customer teams and even internal teams here put a lot of thought into what are requirements.
Mm-hmm.
But I think too often people die by those requirements, right? Where they weren't, like we play the 5 whys, I wanted to do this. Well, why? Well, because of that. Well, why do you want it to do that? And then you figure out that the requirement you're going after is the wrong requirement. Right. So the this is in the development space, there's as much to be had from having the right people in the right seats on the team conversing versus, you've got a framework of what you need, but it tactfully needs to be questioned. Right. And I think more often than not, like, we talk about the 80-20 rule just to move through, right? We are a precision obsessed culture here. Myself, the OCD for certain things can be off the chart, and we accept that. And we keep it locked up. But there's a difference between going from 80% to 90%, to 100. It's exponential, and it's a huge time sink. And what I think the inflection point, is to move from one spot in the project to the next, is to get to that point of diminishing returns.
Yes.
Maybe not even have reaching there's shades of gray, the maybe not even reaching the requirement because the requirement might not have been properly scoped.
Correct.
And then you get, part of this is having the right customers with the right skill sets to converse, but saying, we did this for you.
Yep.
This is like 85%.
Yep.
Is this really what you want? Do you really want to keep going?
Yeah. I mean, that's that project that I was talking about, you don't know everything at the beginning, even if you think you do. And those requirements had to change. And that was something that, we just didn't anticipate needing to be done at the beginning. But yeah, there has to be that healthy push and pull and tug on why are things this way and, throughout the project.
Yeah.
Not just at the beginning.
You can think of metaphorically like, I'm going on a limb here, like non-Newtonian fluids. Where I'm trying to go with this is drag increases, right? Velocity squared, right? So the faster you're trying to move through something, the more drag or friction, the more energy, the more friction there is. And thinking about ways, to be comfortable with the drag, right? The friction is part of the process. You got to know your boundaries for where there's too much friction, or if you feel no friction, are you achieving the goals as quick as the customer needs?
Right.
So maybe I'll end with that thought of how much friction is the right amount of friction to be innovative, agile, and competitive.
Yeah.
That could be a couple of beers.
Happily.
Yeah. Any parting thoughts, Ben?
I don't think so.
Cool. Hey, I really appreciate you joining.
Absolutely.
I think you embody, like, by having those multiple disciplinary skills, that is innovation unto itself.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you. So everyone, thanks for joining in. There will be an additional 2 episodes on this topic. So please stay tuned. Thanks for joining, and please find the buttons below, like, subscribe, follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube, and appreciate your time. Until next time.